Tēnā tātou, no mai, haere mai. Good afternoon and welcome to Cambridge Chats. I'm Jenaia Clarke, Financial Wellbeing Champion and Head of Marketing for Cambridge Partners. If this is your first time at Cambridge Chats, welcome. These sessions, along with our in-person seminars, provide you with some insights on investment themes that relate to the current market. We'll introduce you to other industry experts from our networks, and this provides an opportunity for you to ask questions. Today, we're here to talk about sustainability and investing in ways that align with your own values. And we have a great lineup of speakers today on screen that you'll see, and I'll introduce you to them shortly. Sustainability has shifted our focus because climate change is really upon us. 83% of us believe that climate change is a real thing. 72% are prepared to change behaviour, but more than half of us don't actually know where to start. Our goal today is to leave you with some key takeaways, to leave you inspired by showing you what other people are doing, along with ways that you can make a start into bringing sustainability into your own lives if you haven't started already. Aotearoa New Zealand is seen as a clean, green country, but there's still a lot of work that we need to do. When it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, 50% comes from agriculture, while 40% comes from the creation of energy. So this comes from industrial, commercial, and residential. That 40% is made up from 17%, which comes from transport. So that's all our planes, trains, and automobiles. 12% comes from commerce and industry. That's everything we do in our business workplaces. 6% from electricity generation across the grid, and 2% is electricity used in our homes. 6% comes from non-energy emissions, from minerals, metals, and chemicals, and 4% from waste emissions. So we're doing a really good job at recycling. For those 17% of people that still don't believe that climate change is a real thing, you just have to look at our crazy weather patterns at the moment. Flash floods, droughts, fires. And this year, some of the ski fields couldn't even open because of the warmer temperatures and snow not being able to settle on the ground. Government regulation can make big shifts in a short space of time, and we've seen that when they banned the single-use plastics for shopping bags in retail. Banks are now also playing their part by providing cheaper lending to businesses that want to achieve their own sustainability goals. As a consumer, you have the power to also make a difference through your own purchasing habits, whether that's refraining from buying on Black Friday or choosing companies that you truly know align with your own values. Investing for financial gain and doing good don't have to be mutually exclusive concepts. Today on our panel, we are very privileged to have Dr. Roger Robson-Williams. He's the Chief Sustainability Officer at Plant and Food Research. He'll set the scene for us today and discuss what sustainability is and some of the key opportunities and challenges we face. He'll also provide insights into initiatives that Plant and Food Research are doing and the decisions consumers can make to be more sustainable. Bridget Romanes, founder and principal at Mobile Relocation. Bridget will be looking at the social impacts of following your values to realise your own goals. She'll discuss why more people are moving to New Zealand, seeking the clean, green dream, and what may happen when they get here. Dominic Sheehan, financial advisor and head of sustainability at Cambridge Partners. Dom will discuss what sustainable investing means and introduce some key terms and concepts, including options for investors. He'll talk about some challenges and investigate the trade-off between targeting a social return versus a financial return. So welcome to all our speakers. Thanks for joining us today. Before we start, I just want to go over a little bit of housekeeping. Each of our speakers will be talking for about 10 to 15 minutes today. We'll have a panel discussion at the end, and that's your opportunity to ask questions. And we'll finish up by 1 p.m. If you can't stay for the full webinar, don't worry. We'll be able to send you a replay tomorrow. For those of you that are new to Zoom webinars, firstly, we can't see or hear you, so you're welcome to have your lunch while we chat away. In your panel on screen, you'll see 3 boxes: chat, raise your hand, and Q&A. We won't be using the chat or raise your hand buttons today, but if you'd like to ask a question, the way to do it is in the Q&A. These come through as a direct message to us, so only we can see it. I have our CX specialist, Anya Clarkson, monitoring these during the webinar today. But if we don't get a chance to answer your questions, we'll get back to you after. So I just wanted to give you a bit of a disclaimer first. Please note that the opinions of our speakers are their own. We're giving general information which doesn't consider your personal situation or financial goals. So please don't consider this personalised financial advice. Any discussion on past financial performance is no guarantee of future returns. So now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Roger Robson-Williams. He's the Chief Sustainability Officer at Plant and Food Research. Roger leads the sustainability agenda at the New Zealand Institute for Plant and Food Research and is responsible for working with anyone and everyone across the organisation and beyond to make it a more sustainable, future-fit provider of great science. Roger moved to New Zealand in 2012 to join the Foundation for Arable Research as Director of Research Development. While there, he developed a keen interest in sustainability issues, and particularly in the impacts of primary production on the environment. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Roger Robson-Williams.
Tēnā koutou katoa, and thanks Jenaia and Cambridge Partners for the opportunity to address this webinar this afternoon. I'm very much looking forward to it. If I could have my first slide, please. In fact, if I could have my second slide, that would be even better. So my first car was a Morris Minor van, like the one in the picture there. Now, I owned it toward the end of its useful life, but when that car rolled off the production line in Cowley in the UK in 1970, a remarkable team of researchers led by Donella Meadows were looking at the question of how sustainable the consumption of the world's finite resources was, and how whether or not we should be concerned about the accumulation of pollution and waste materials from all of our economic activity. And they put together this book shown here, The Limits to Growth, that was published in 1972. That painted, I have to say, a rather bleak picture about the future of human civilization, to be honest, on the basis of the rate at which we were both depleting finite resources and accumulating pollution and toxins in the environment. And unfortunately, since that was published in 1972, we haven't taken very great steps to address the concerns that were raised in that book. If I could have my next slide, please. However, we have become a lot more sophisticated in our understanding of the impact that we're having on the Earth's life-supporting systems. And one expression of that is in the concept of planetary boundaries. Now, the idea here is that we've studied the Earth's life-supporting systems, and these, if you like, define an ecological ceiling to human activity. So these define the limits of the Earth's capacity to provide certain resources and deal with pollution, including, for example, greenhouse gases. And without going into great detail, there are 9 of them, and the yellow on this slide here shows the extent to which we're overshooting several of them. And the one I want to talk a little bit about in a moment is climate change. And now we all know that this is something that's very much in the media at the moment, very much an existential threat to the way we live our lives. And that's just one of 9 planetary boundaries, or 9 aspects of the life supporting systems on Earth. So if I could move on to the next slide. So that says something about the ecological limits that we need to operate in. But we're human beings, and where are the people in all of this? Because clearly people play a hugely important role in sustainability. And an academic in the UK called Kate Rayworth came up with the concept of donut economics as a way of thinking about those planetary boundaries, that ecological ceiling that we need to operate in, but also in the context of a social foundation. So this is the a baseline for people's access to water and food and healthcare and education, if you like, a floor below which nobody should have to live. And so with that social foundation in the center and below which nobody should have to live, and then that ecological ceiling defined by the planetary boundaries I mentioned earlier, we define between those two rings the safe operating space for human civilization, operating within the ecological limits of the planet and providing for those basic human needs of, as I say, food, healthcare, education, employment opportunities, and so on. If I could have the next slide, please. So coming back to climate change, something that is on all of our minds at the moment. And this photograph here is from Radio New Zealand. This is back in August, and the Nelson floods. And this is just one expression very close to home of the very real impacts of climate change. And I think it's really useful to consider how close to home some of these impacts are. It can be really difficult with issues like climate change and other environmental issues to understand really the significance of them, because they're often displaced, the impacts are displaced in space and time. You know, the worst effects are felt elsewhere and perhaps for future generations. But this photograph for me of a group of Kiwis who have been flooded out of their homes, waiting to hear what's going to happen, is, I think, very poignant in terms of really highlighting the impacts that we're feeling from climate change even now. Next slide, please. So how do we thrive in the 21st century? What does it mean to operate, to live within that safe operating space, within the ecological ceiling of the planet, and recognizing that social foundation that we want people to be able to live above? And I just wanted to reflect at a personal level, firstly. So my wife and I, we are very keen gardeners, and we're part of the community gardening movement. That's something that we feel is good, helping people to grow food, develop a sense of community, get some fresh air and exercise. And sticking with the food theme, we're fortunate enough to have enough land to grow quite a lot of our own food, and to be able to share that with the community. So that's one dimension of the way we express our attempts to thrive in the 21st century. We are on our second electric vehicle. We've got a large solar panel array at home, so we're mostly able to charge it up free of charge and without harming any fossil dinosaurs. And the picture, the handsome chap up there in the top right-hand corner, Paul Choi of Cambridge Partners, and we've chosen Cambridge Partners to help us align our investments with our values, to have some control over how the capital that we have stewardship over is used. And I don't say these things to set myself up on any kind of pedestal, just to provide some practical insights into some of the things that my wife and I are doing to try and make real living within that safe operating space. If I could have the next slide, please. And then thinking about the organization that I work for. So what does it mean for an organization to thrive in the 21st century? And some dimensions of that for plant and food research are taking responsibility for our carbon emissions. So we are poised to be to complete a carbon audit, be certified carbon reduced, which means we not only know what our carbon footprint is, but we have a plan in place to reduce it. So that's one dimension. We share surplus produce from our farms and orchards with local food banks and food charities, and the picture in the top right-hand corner is just a large quantity of surplus onions in Hawke's Bay heading off to a food bank. And we share our scientific knowledge and insights in less developed parts of the world to help improve food safety and production, being very mindful that we don't have all the answers. We are not trying to kind of helicopter in and tell other people how to run their farms and horticultural outputs. And I think something that generally sets New Zealand overseas development apart from other nations is that we very much work in partnership with those countries rather than suggesting we've got all the answers. And then finally, of course, our bread and butter work as a research organisation is to provide our own orchardists and farmers with new insights and new crop varieties to help them produce healthier food with fewer inputs of energy and fertilizer and water, and with less of an impact on the environment. So that's some of the dimensions that Planet Food is trying to thrive in the 21st century. Next slide, please. So I mentioned a couple of books already, The Limits to Growth by Donella Meadows and Donut Economics by Kate Rayworth. And this third book recommendation by Tim Jackson, Prosperity Without Growth. The second edition was published in 2017, and I really commend it as a summary of many of the things that I've touched on. It pulls together the concepts of planetary boundaries, donut economics, and asks the question, can we continue to grow our economy? What does prosperity look like? What's a broader definition of prosperity than merely financial prosperity? And I would thoroughly recommend it as a good read for anybody with an interest in the future of human society, to be honest. And then I have just one more slide, which is just a nice picture of those three books, which all of which I commend to you as great reading and insights. And if you're interested in understanding how your capital can be used for good, have a read of one or all of those. Thank you very much.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Roger. Now for our next speaker, Bridget Romanes, founder and principal of Mobile Relocation. Bridget is a global mobility practitioner and strategist with a background as a diplomat, expat, communicator, and analyst who has spent many years living and working internationally. She founded Mobile Relocation in 2016. Mobile's award-winning resettlement programs provide the end-to-end planning, personalised support and local knowledge newcomers need to make their Kiwi dream a reality. Please welcome Bridget Romanes.
Kia ora koutou, everybody. Thank you very much for having me along to this session today. I learned a lot from Roger already. My topic is slightly different, but I did pick up the emphasis in donut economics on social foundations. And I think that's a really core part of what we do with our clients. So just to recap, I guess a number of Cambridge Partners investors, some of whom we work with, are looking to relocate to New Zealand and also looking at sustainable investing in the same breath. They have a perception of New Zealand as being the type of society and economy that they want to live in. So we're involved in working with them, organising resettlement programs for them so that they can make the most of their life here. And that can range from everything to finding housing, to setting up schooling, to all the logistics of moving from one country to another. I thought it might be useful for me just to outline what our typical client looks like. There's sort of two categories, really. One is an investor migrant who generally is coming to New Zealand with a significant amount of wealth, and they want to invest that sustainably in New Zealand. And they're attracted to New Zealand not just for the investment potential, but also because it's a place that they want to be. And then the second typical client profile is somebody who's well established in their career. They're sort of at C-suite level or have a senior technical skill set. So they're still going to be working when they come to New Zealand and contributing to the local economy, but they're bringing wealth to New Zealand with them, and they are looking at investment opportunities here that match their values. So sometimes these people have travelled to New Zealand before. They might have been on holiday before. Perhaps they're Kiwis who've lived overseas who have spent the golden summers here over a number of years. So they're familiar with New Zealand. They know that it's a place that aligns with their values, but they're not familiar with actually living here. So we deliver a bit of a reality check and help them sort of get through that process of getting established in New Zealand. Could we jump onto the next slide, please? So really what I want to hone in here on is values-driven migration. And what I'm talking about here is values, not financial value. So people will be investing money in New Zealand, but they are more interested in joining the value set that they perceive New Zealand is offering to them. So this can be a double-edged sword. And the reason why I want to talk about this is because if any of the listeners are in fact looking at relocating to New Zealand and have this very strong values-driven approach, or any other advisors who are working with this type of client, it's really important to understand both the pitfalls and advantages that face people who are coming to New Zealand for those reasons. On the positive side, New Zealand, we know this, I'm very frank about it, we can't compete on salary and, big job titles and amazing roles that might be available in other parts of the world. So for the people who choose to come here from a values perspective, those are not their primary reason for coming here. So they're not going to be disappointed. They know up front that they're probably going to be looking at a different type of career or different salary levels, and their lifestyle is going to be quite different. So they're very aware of that when they arrive. The negative side is that their expectations are around more emotional factors. They often have really high expectations about the type of paradise that New Zealand might be and how easy it will be for them to resettle. Often they're disenchanted with the economic and social makeup of the country they're coming from, and they have a filtered version of New Zealand through the media. You may have a filtered version of New Zealand through the media if you're an investor in this situation. No country's perfect, New Zealand's not perfect either. So it's quite easy when you're in that situation to get easily discouraged when you arrive here, and some of the practicalities of life are different and difficult, and that there is more nuance to New Zealand society than may be evident from the outside. That's not necessarily a bad thing, it's a matter of coming to terms with it. And the broad brush picture that's given to New Zealand internationally is in a broad brush way accurate. But I just have asked to show this slide today because I think this is something that anybody who's relocating to New Zealand needs to be aware of. But if you're a values-driven migrant, this is particularly important. These phases of relocation are well researched by an international cross-cultural expert, Hofstede. And I'll just quickly track through this. The first phase of anybody relocating countries is one of honeymoon. You finally made it here. You might have been waiting for 2.5 years during COVID to get here. It looks beautiful. People are really friendly. It seems great. You've got your rose-tinted glasses on and life is good. That period lasts for a while, and enjoy it while you can, because inevitably most people then go into a period of, let's politely call it disillusionment, where they find that things are still sold in plastic packaging in New Zealand. Perhaps they're finding it difficult to find a network of like-minded people. Some of those things which take a little bit longer to access when you move to a new place get people down, and it starts to feel that the negatives outweigh the positives. And be reassured that this is something that the vast majority of people go through, whether you're a values-driven migrant or not. But I think for values-driven migrants, it's particularly poignant because it is very much an emotional decision to come here, and it can feel like you've made a huge mistake. And that it's your fault, you've done something wrong. In fact, the vast majority of people then move into the third stage, which is acculturation, where you do start to get to know people who are like-minded. Some of the things that annoyed you when you first arrive, you either figure out workarounds or you come to terms with, and you achieve a more balanced view of New Zealand. What's really important to keep in mind through this whole process, which I have to tell you can take up to 2 years, is what your big goal is. And I think that's a real strength with the values-driven migrant. Your big goal when you're coming to New Zealand is to be part of what you perceive and increasingly are able to make a reality of, that New Zealand is the kind of place that you want to live in. So if you can keep that in mind through the tough times and work towards it, that's going to make your resettlement here easier and your attainment of your big picture goals that much more likely. We'll just jump on to the next slide. I'd just like to wrap up really here by drawing an analogy between the financial planning that most of you are engaged with in your interaction with Cambridge partners and the planning that also needs to take place for relocation. People often have top of mind, I do need to plan about my money, and sometimes the relocation process is something that people expect will just unfold or take it step by step. In the same way that you plan your financial future, is really, really important to plan your future on a personal level when you relocate too. So again, for those of you who are already talking to Cambridge partners before you arrive in New Zealand, you need to also be thinking about your relocation planning pre-arrival, doing research and talking to trusted advisors about what life's going to be like in New Zealand and what the pathway is for you to achieve your goals. When you get here, by that stage, your finances should be already planned, so you can disengage from Cambridge partners just a little bit and engage with somebody like us a bit more to work on those sort of intensive things that you need to get sorted out when you arrive to a new country, which is so important in setting up your personal social foundations. Having a place that you like to live, having your kids happy in school, understanding how to get around the place, learning about the city, getting a car, all of those basics. And then the third phase really is what we call support, networking, and connection. And that's what embeds you in a place. And this is what's going to help you get through that dip part of the relocation cycle. So being supported to get to know people who are like-minded, share your values, fitting into New Zealand, building relationships that are going to build over time into real friendships, because you don't get those connections when you first arrive in a place, and that's what you'll be leaving behind. And finally, I'd just like to leave you, if anybody is interested, you can jump onto our website, which is listed there, mobile-relocation.com, and there's a checklist there which is very intensive and covers everything from the emotional aspect of relocating through logistics and practicalities, and it will help you give an overview of what Move to New Zealand planning looks like, and hopefully help you work through some of that in a focused and targeted ways to build you for success in New Zealand. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bridget. There's some great insights in your presentation there, and I'm sure anyone that's moved to New Zealand has definitely gone through those cycles. So that's really interesting that you're able to point it out in a way like that, and that, you know, sometimes it can take that sort of 2 years to really embed yourself into and build your networks and community. So thank you. Our next speaker is Dominic Sheehan. Dominic is a financial advisor and head of sustainability at Cambridge Partners. He leads the development and execution of our roadmap to improve the impact that our business has on the environment and society. He also contributes to the development of our sustainable investment solutions and is a thought leader in sustainable investment advice and how we can incorporate values into our investments. Please welcome Dominic Sheehan.
Thank you, Jenaia. Kia ora, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. It was really interesting listening to both Bridget and Dr. Roger just now. And I think there's going to be some strong parallels with Bridget's talk in regards to values-based decision-making and Dr. Roger's talk in regards to operating and making decisions within, you know, planetary boundaries, which will hopefully come through in my little chat here. So as you can see on the screen, I'm going to be talking a bit about sustainable investing, specifically what it is, how it can have a real-world impact, and what can we expect from returns when investing sustainably. But before I jump into those topics, I thought it might be helpful to just take a step back and think about sustainable investing sort of conceptually, and also look a little bit at the history of it, because that might help to provide some context to some of the topics I'll cover today. So you can argue that, actually the slide's fine. You can argue that sustainable investing is essentially as old as currency, and it's not, but you can argue that. And the way that you can argue that is, if we go back to the origins of currency, let's talk about the Mesopotamian shekel, 2000 BC. Even back 2,000 years, but 2000 BC, there still would have been some people who had a surplus of shekels and some people that had a deficit. And those who had more shekels than they needed would have been willing to invest them into organizations or initiatives to help do something. Now, with investing their shekels, they would have expected a financial return for most of them. But for some of those decisions, there would have been a value component to that as well. They would have been thinking, well, I could invest in this organization, which is going to start a shop and maybe make some money, or I could invest in this organization, which is going to build some wells. They'll make some money, but then they'll also deliver clean drinking water to the city. And I think that distinction between having a second objective, not just making money, but also doing some good with your money is what I consider sustainable investing to be. Now, if we go forward a few thousand years from Mesopotamian society to the 18th century, that's when sustainable investing started to become a little bit more formalized, and the Quakers actually were quite instrumental in documenting and making decisions based on values with their investing. So they made the conscious decision not to invest in alcohol or tobacco or gambling organizations, and so that was the base of what's essentially become SRI, or socially responsible investing, which I'll talk about shortly. Go forwards further to the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s, and that's when it became really quite clear and formalized. That's when in 1971, the first sustainable investment fund came along. It was called the Pax World Fund. And essentially that was a fund which was opposed to the war in Vietnam. So they were choosing not to invest in any organizations that supported the Vietnam War, and then come through today. And it's really got momentum. It's a really huge topic. KiwiSavers, the majority of them now have some sustainable investment credential on them. When you look at data on fund flows, it's really got to the point that more money is flowing into sustainable investment solutions than other more traditional investment solutions. So it's really a material thing now. It's got a lot of momentum, and so it's a pretty relevant topic for us to talk about. So on this slide here, I've got a bit of a scale. It's supposed to go from light green to dark green. And I think a scale is a helpful way of looking at this topic, because simply saying that you've got a sustainable investment or you want to invest sustainably, that's a really, really broad array of things that you can do with your money. So if we start at this left end of the scale, we've got conventional investments with some sustainability consideration. And this is actually going to be the majority of what you're going to come across when you've got some money and you're looking to invest it. Most of the KiwiSaver funds that advertise themselves as being sustainable investments would be at this end of the scale. And even our Cambridge partners, Sustainable Investment Solutions, they start at this end of the scale. If someone comes in and they say that they've got values which they want to incorporate into their investments, this is typically the starting point, and you can look at making changes from there. There's a couple of terms that you're going to come across at this end of the scale. One is socially responsible investing. One is environmental, social, and governance investing. They're different. However, there's no globally adopted consensus or definition around these terms, and as such, they're used differently by different organizations. So I think instead of focusing on the term and what it means, I'll talk a bit more about what I think is a bigger driver on change in the world and financial return. So I'll talk about that shortly. Just before I do, though, at the other end of the scale, the dark green end, we've got sustainable investments or some financial consideration. So this is where instead of getting a financial return as your first objective and doing some good in the world as your second, we've flipped that on the head here and we're saying doing some good in the world as your primary objective and getting a financial return as your secondary. If you go right the way off the scale, you're going to hit philanthropy and charity. But just before then, we've got a couple of terms to touch on. So impact investing, that's where you invest specifically in an organization or an initiative because they're doing something or they're going to do something that you want to support. So that could be investing in an organization which is, like the Mesopotamian example, going to build wells, provide clean drinking water. Or it could be investing specifically in a project which is going to build some new wind farms or whatever it might be. Thematic investing is a little bit different because instead of consciously choosing a specific initiative or organization you want to support, you're instead spreading that across a number of organizations which have a common theme. So that could be, I want to invest in organizations that are promoting clean power generation or that are designing and distributing electric cars or whatever it might be. It's a theme which has some sustainability objective attached. So as I mentioned when talking about conventional investments with some sustainability consideration, I said that the terms can mean different things. And so what really matters is what the underlying fund managers are actually doing. And this is something that I call the approach. So if we go on to the next slide, I've got three broad approaches mapped out here. The first one being you could punish underperformers. And when I say underperformers or overperformers, I'm talking in regards to the sustainability performance of the organization. You can reward outperformers or you can work with or influence the companies. So in that first example, punish underperformers, we've got a little graph over on the right, which says ExxonMobil investment, and it compares an index exposure to a sustainable portfolio exposure. So what an index is it's essentially a group of companies. A good example of them would be if you're looking at the companies which are listed on the New Zealand Stock Exchange, the 50 largest ones, we call the NZX 50. And so it's just any group of companies for whatever the objective may be. So let's say within a particular index, it might be the largest 500 companies in the US, for example. You might have a reasonably large exposure to ExxonMobil because they're a reasonably large company. However, if you were wanting to punish them hypothetically because of the impact that oil mining and distribution can have on climate change, you might choose to reduce or even omit them from your portfolio. So that's one way of punishing underperformers. If we go to the next level down where we've got rewarding outperformers, this is effectively the opposite. So let's say on New Zealand Stock Exchange 50, Mercury Energy might be a pretty small piece of that, but because you like what they're doing in regards to they've got a commitment to 100% renewable energy generation, you might say, well, I'm going to double or triple that investment in them to increase my exposure to that company. So that's one way that you can reward outperformers. And working with or influencing is where you use your right to vote as a shareholder to influence what the company does. This could be, the example that we have here is voting to adopt climate reporting. So some companies will just choose to do that of their own initiative. Other companies, they won't have chosen to do that, and the shareholders feel, well, this is something the company should really do to start tracking and reducing their emissions. So we're going to put forward an action for the company to consider, and we're going to all vote on it. And if that vote goes through, well, then there's some positive change. So if we can go to the next slide now. Thanks, Anya. So let's talk a little bit about these three approaches and how they actually can drive real change in the world. So that first one, punishing underperformers. So if a whole lot of people do this and they all choose to start removing oil and gas companies as an easy example, right? So let's take those. So we start to remove oil and gas companies from our share portfolios. That means that there'll be less demand to buy those shares, and all else unchanged, there'd be less demand, and that can push their price down. Now, when the price goes down, that means that if the company wants to raise some more money, perhaps they're going to sell some more shares on the market, they're going to have to sell a larger percentage of the company to get the equivalent amount of money, which they can then use for growth of projects. So essentially, it becomes more expensive for those, or it can become more expensive for those companies to raise money. Companies like to raise money as cheaply as possible, so that's an incentive for them to clean up their act. The exact opposite can happen with rewarding outperformers, right? So if more people choose to invest in Mercury or Allbirds or whatever the sustainable company might be, that can mean there's more demand for their shares, which all else unchanged can mean that the share price can go up. So if they chose to raise some more money, it would be cheaper for them to do that, which is a good thing for companies. So there's a bit of incentive there. Now, there's some academic research which is starting to be done into this space to work out how effective this driver is and how tangible the impact of it's been. And it's a bit of a mixed bag of results. Jenaia, you mentioned in your intro about how some banks are starting to give discounts on fixed interest securities or bond issues, or just loans in general for companies that are demonstrating positive sustainability performance, or they might have a sustainability target attached to that bond. And that's very true. And that's a really tangible and easy to quantify benefit from that type of initiative. For the less direct approach, which is simply choosing to exclude or increase exposure to an investment in your portfolio, the academic evidence is still a bit unconclusive on how effective that is. Now, that third piece we have there, working with or influencing companies, so that's using your right to vote as a shareholder, that's pretty easy to work out how that has an impact, because if you vote for something and it happens, well, then it happens, and you can tangibly say, well, this positive change has or hasn't occurred. The most common mechanism there is voting in or out a shareholder, depending on how good of a track record they have with promoting a sustainability agenda in the organisation. So if we could please go on to the next slide now. So our next topic is, can you expect financial returns to be better or worse? And I've got two quotes for you up on screen. So the first one by James Ning, Financial Times editor, who said, the outperformance of ESG strategies is beyond doubt. So he was pretty confident in saying that, yep, ESG strategies are doing really well. And the context or history to that comment is in the couple of years leading up to 2022, generally speaking, sustainable investment strategies did outperform financially their traditional counterparts. Now, the bit which is important to pull out here is, was that outperformance because they were sustainable companies, or was that outperformance because of other broader market considerations? And part of one of the big drivers of that performance is when most sustainable investment strategies will reduce exposure to oil and gas companies, and by default, they will increase exposure to technology companies, because technology companies typically have with some exceptions, will generally have less of a negative impact on climate change, whereas oil and gas companies, it's pretty easy to draw the correlation they have with climate change. So technology companies just happened to do really, really well in 2020, 2021, a lot of growth in that area. Oil and gas companies didn't do very well in those years. So that's part of the reason why the performance was there. Now come 2022, that performance has kind of switched over, and oil and gas companies have actually done comparatively better in 2022, and technology companies have had a pretty rubbish time. So I think the point that I'm trying to draw there is there are other impacts on financial performance which likely have greater impact than a sustainability factor. And Jared Dillion's quote there, ESG investing looks like just another stock bubble. So as you can see, he has a different opinion to James Ning. And where that comment comes from is, earlier I mentioned that one of the ways that you can reward outperforming companies is to invest more in them. That means that there's potentially money flowing into those companies, which is based on values as opposed to financial performance. And Jared is arguing that that will come to a head at some point in time, in the same way that other bubbles have burst. Now, my personal opinion on the matter is we genuinely don't know whether or not sustainable investment strategies or traditional strategies will outperform financially over the long term. But I do think that a really, really good starting point is like Bridget mentioned, incorporate values into your decision-making process. Work out what kind of financial return do we need to target to achieve our financial goals, and also work out what are my personal values and how do I want to reflect those through my sustainable investment. And through that, you'll be able to work out where along that green scale you should be sitting. So if we can just go on to the last slide now, I've just got some points in summary. So sustainable investment is a broad term, and not all sustainable investments are the same. And I think that's really important when you see sustainable investment opportunities. Simply having the word on the label, that can mean a lot, but it can also not mean a lot. So it is important to dig a little bit deeper and try and understand how that investment is being sustainable. Sustainable investments can deliver real world value, but it's just a small piece of a big puzzle. Like Dr. Richard mentioned, it's one of the things that you can do in your life, but there are also lots of other things that you can do in your life. And it's not going to be a silver bullet, which is going to solve climate change, but it is going to help contribute. And then the third one is, returns can be better or worse, but other economic drivers are likely to have a bigger impact on financial performance. Cheers.
Thanks, Dom. That's really awesome. So now we're going to move into our Q&A panel discussion. We encourage all of your questions today. So if you have one, just pop it in the box and we'll get to it. But just a reminder that we can't give personalised financial advice. If your question is personal, then we'll get back to you after the session. So I've got some pre-prepared questions to kick off the session while you're dropping your questions in, and we've got about 10 minutes before we finish up. So first up, this one is a question for Dr. Roger. What are you seeing that gives you cause to be hopeful?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jenaia. So first up, that we're having this conversation today, and we're having similar conversations all around the place. So that gives me hope. People are paying attention and concerned and willing to invest time in understanding. Another reason for hope would be a recent trip to the UK and just seeing the extent of expansion of rooftop solar generation that's gone on, and that combined with a whole bunch of other infrastructure changes. The UK has now had several days in the summer of 100% renewable power generation, which may not seem that remarkable coming from New Zealand, where we enjoy year-round about 85% renewable power. But for a nation that invented the Industrial Revolution and was powered for so long by coal and gas, it's a really remarkable achievement. So seeing those kind of big systemic changes. And lastly, we as a human species can have a huge impact on the planet, positively or negatively. We have the power to make positive change through all sorts of things, including the way we utilize our financial capital. And so that gives me hope that we can make some sensible decisions. Thank you.
Thanks. Bridget, one question for you. What do people underestimate or find most difficult about relocating to New Zealand?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think one of my clients made a comment to me that sums that up. He was coming from the US, but it could have been from anywhere. He said to me, Bridget, it all looks the same on the surface, but the infrastructure underneath is completely different. And I think that sums it up perfectly. A lot of people underestimate what it's like to move to New Zealand. There's lots of pictures of New Zealand out there. If you come from an English-speaking country, it's English-speaking here. But a lot of things beneath the surface are different, from the way the housing market works to our unique educational qualification for children, to the fact that, and I think about the values-based migrants in particular, it's a very relationship-driven society in New Zealand. In other countries, you go online, you'd immediately find a group that you could join to follow a particular thing that you're interested in. That exists in New Zealand. We're not, in the dark ages, but you'll get far more mileage from meeting people and being introduced to other people and connected. It's very, very personal. And that's actually quite easy to do, which is another thing that people sometimes underestimate here. With 5 million people, you get introduced to a lot of people pretty quickly if you get out there and do it. It's not an anonymous place like moving to a large city overseas is. So that's a few examples of both positive and negative underestimations that people sometimes make.
Yeah, thank you. Dom, this is a question for you. Can you tell us what Cambridge Partners are doing in regards to sustainability?
Yeah, absolutely. Like a lot of organizations and people, this is a thing that we've identified as being really important, but we're at an early stage in a long journey. And I think it is important to see this as a journey as opposed to a specific objective. We're never going to really get to the point of being perfect, but it's just we're starting along the pathway. So one of the things that we're doing is looking at our investment solutions, trying to make sure that they're authentic and they're genuinely doing some good for the world, as well as allowing the options for our investors to incorporate their values if they choose to. Another area that we're looking at is same as Dr. Roger mentioned with plant food and research. We're looking at measuring and reducing our carbon emissions. We're doing that with Toitū EnviroCare. And then the other area that we're looking at is in developing a bit of a roadmap to work out how can, for context, there's the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There's a list of goals that the UN have announced. Basically, these are things that organizations and governments should look at, progressing these particular issues, which will make the world a better place. So it's things like access to clean water, no poverty, good quality education, those kind of typical social and environmental issues. So we've been going through the process of working out which ones of these UN SDGs impact or can be influenced by Cambridge Partners, and subsequently what can we do to help progress them.
Awesome, thank you. Dr. Roger, I had one for you. One of the things I saw in your presentation was your really awesome veggie exchange. And I live in Devonport and Auckland, and we have community pantries as well, where people take their overflow of homegrown vegetables or even items from their pantry to help those in need. Do you see that this is something that's going to be popping up more and more around the country due to, the cost of the supermarket and inflation driving up prices? Do you see this as something that's going to be popping up more often around the country?
Yeah, I mean, on one level, I hope so, because there is a need out there for it. But obviously, on the other hand, I very much regret that the need exists. And, again, my recent visit to the UK, it was interesting to hear about initiatives, for example, in schools where pupils are sent home with a recipe and ingredients for a meal, because many people are, to be blunt, are too proud to go to a food bank, and in order to avoid, food deficit, that's a slightly subversive way of getting food into homes. So yes, and I personally think the Veg Exchange, the kind of community pantry, is a great initiative, reducing food waste, helping families in need, and building a sense of community. So I hope it expands, but I slightly regret that it needs to.
Yeah, that's so true. We have a question that's come in, and Dom, you might be more suitable to answer this question. Are there ESG or similar funds in New Zealand? And if so, how are they performing relative to other ESGs around the world? We probably don't have performance information at hand here today, but we might be able to get some to after. Do you want to have a go at that, Dom?
Yeah, I can provide some context there. So in first bit of that is yes, there are definitely ESG funds available in New Zealand. And just a point of distinction there is you can have New Zealand ESG funds which invest in New Zealand organisations, and you can also have New Zealand invest ESG funds which are based in New Zealand but actually invest in organisations all around the world. So both of those are available. And in regards to comparison of performance, well, it really depends on what they're invested in. So you could, for example, have a New Zealand investment ESG fund, which is invested in New Zealand Stock Exchange 50 index with some adjustments to make it more ESG, so removing some of the poorer performers, increasing some of the better performers. And the performance of that is going to be broadly similar. There'll be some difference, but broadly similar to the index or its traditional counterpart. Conversely, you could also have a New Zealand ESG investment, which is investing in American companies. So I think that, yeah, to answer your question, yes, there are definitely ESG funds in New Zealand. They're really accessible now. Most KiwiSavers will also provide an ESG option, but it's all going to ultimately depend on what they're invested in, which will dictate what their performance has been.
Awesome. Hope that answers your question. Bridget, I had a question for you. Have you seen more people or more interest in people migrating here since COVID happened?
Yes, short answer. Yeah, of course, it's pent-up demand because they haven't been able to get here until July this year. So yes, we have a huge backlog of clients who are, working their way through the immigration process. And I think to a certain degree, that has been driven by factors within New Zealand and the profile around the way that COVID was handled here, and greater profile for New Zealand itself, and then also the political and economic turmoil that is happening in other parts of the world has been a push factor. The new investor migrant policy makes it a little bit more difficult for people to come here in terms of the requirements for investment. But then we see a steady stream of people coming through our corporate clients who are, yes, they're coming here for a job in New Zealand, but they're also coming because it's where they want to live from a values-based point of view as well.
I really liked how you said that, even when you go through the dips, you just have to focus on the end goal. I think that's really important, even from a financial advice point of view too. It's like having a plan, sticking to it, and to achieve your goal. It's so important. One other question that I had was, what are some of the certifications that people can look for when they're looking at investing in companies? And it may just be from buying companies that align with their own values.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Roger probably has some comments on this. Maybe if you want to talk about B Corp, I've already touched a little bit on Toitu.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think as Dominic said in his slide deck, there are no kind of, globally agreed sort of standards for environmental performance or social and governance performance for that matter, but there are some schemes that are getting a bit of traction. B Corp is one, and that assesses companies across a whole range of sustainability metrics, environment and social dimensions to that. There are other initiatives such as the Future Fit Business Benchmark, which aim to do a similar thing. There are schemes that rank different organizations in relation to their sort of relative performance. And then there, if you look at something specific like carbon emissions, there are schemes like Toy to EnviroCare, which will certify your carbon footprint and certify that you are on a path to reducing those emissions. So it is a slightly confusing environment. I think the only other comment I would make is that there is a movement towards annual reporting, which discloses more than just financial dimensions of an organization's performance. Integrated reporting is one of the technical terms for this, where companies try and make explicit the different sorts of value they're creating, the social value they're creating, the impact they're having on the environment, as well as financial performance. And so looking out for integrated reporting is another thing that you can do as a potential investor to understand some of the dimensions of a company's activities. But it is a complicated space. There's no getting away from it. And that's because sustainability is about trade-offs, essentially.
Yeah.
Great question.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all the questions we've got for today. So a special thank you to our guest speakers, Bridget and Dr. Roger. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to present today. And as we all love a good book recommendation, The Limits to Growth from 1972. The original is quite rare to find, but you'll be able to find the 30th anniversary edition through Book Depository. Prosperity Without Growth by Tim Jackson, and Donut Economics by Kate Raworth. Kate Raworth, yeah.
That's it.
That's the one. Thanks again, guys, for coming today. Thanks, Dom. If you'd like any further information, please drop us a message, info@cambridgepartners.co.nz. We'll be sending a replay out to you tomorrow. For now, kia tau, te mauri I tēnei rangi, mā te wā. Have a great day. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.
Kia ora.
Cheers, kia ora.